People are very emotionally invested in their economics. Let's integrate this into our field. But no, like the resistance is very strong. It was a little hard to get time with Stephanie at first, right? Because she was in such high demand. But somehow she luckily just, some persistence, and she agreed to let me come film with her.
What I loved the most about MMT, Maren, was that it's so accessible. Even if you don't care about economics, it's so captivating. You're so intrigued into the story. You just want to know more. And you haven't filled it with loads of technical terms, and it's not a bunch of economists just blabbing on about the economy. The everyday person is going to watch that film and feel, oh my gosh, I've been lied to my whole life. You broke down what people believe in, while also captivating and engaging with people who might not understand economics. And I think that's what's so impactful about Finding the Money.
This episode is with Maren Poitras, movie director of new movie Finding the Money, a documentary about MMT, modern monetary theory, a theory that basically breaks down everything you thought you knew about money.
A fantastic film which follows main character Stephanie Kelton, who's pushing the modern monetary theory. We also talk in this podcast about how relevant MMT is, especially in the UK, with Rachel Reeves harping on about the black hole in the public deficit. We also talk about Maren's 5-year journey, being an independent filmmaker, pushing this alone. This film is fantastic. It's out now, and we highly encourage you guys to check it out.
Yeah, out on Vimeo, link in the description. Fantastic film. We loved it. It was revolutionary for us when we watched it for the first time. Super relevant. So check it out and enjoy this podcast. It was great. Like and subscribe, support us, and hope you enjoy.
The Inspire Us podcast.
Could you kind of say what is modern monetary theory?
Yeah, definitely. And of course, it's this whole, body of work that a group of folks have been working on for some decades now. But I think the core of it, where it really starts, is just this fundamental acknowledgement that the federal government, or these kind of sovereign governments around the world, so the US, the UK, Switzerland, Canada, Japan, China, South Korea, the list goes on, they're the issuer of their own currency. Right, the U.S. issues the U.S. dollar, the U.K. issues the U.K. pound, the British pound, and so that's where that currency comes from. Right, we call it money, and even the word money. Warren Mosler, kind of the grandfather of MMT, likes to say, try not to use the word money because it's so vague. It almost makes it seem like it's this international phenomenon, that it's almost this natural object that we all go out and find, dig up out of the ground somewhere. But really, no, it has a clear legal meaning in terms of what a currency is and where it comes from and who issues it. And so if you start from, this fairly obvious, I think it's fairly widely agreed upon that the federal government is the issuer of the currency in the US and the UK and elsewhere. If you ask an economist that question, they'll be like, yes, yeah, they're the issuer of the currency. But then following that assumption, well, then what is the national debt, or why is the government having to borrow this thing that they are the sole issuer of, right? Because then those same economists are warning, oh my gosh, the debt to GDP ratio is unsustainable. The debt is growing to this unsustainable level. There's terrible things that are going to happen. We might go bankrupt or default, or interest rates will spike because investors, right, are going to demand higher interest rates because they think the government might go bankrupt, right? That's the risk. But how, again, going back to that first premise, that first assumption, if the government's the issuer of that currency, how could they run out or go bankrupt? So it's that very fundamental conundrum that I think is really where you have to start, where MMT starts, and I think where the divergence starts between MMT and mainstream economics, right? So it seems, very simple in a way, and yet there's a lot of implications if you actually take that assumption seriously, I think. And I think that's the difference, that mainstream economists, they'll admit it, but then they kind of put it away, and their textbooks aren't built upon that assumption.
Mm. And it's true that one assumption has many repercussions and many different kind of lessons that you can learn. And the movie kind of goes over that, you know, as you have the different lesson one, you talk about, you know, how that impacts taxes, how that impacts, you know, bonds, or, you know, why do we borrow, and goes through all these things. And each one of these aspects kind of is it completely left to where someone would think right, you know, or is it completely opposite to what someone is thinking. And how was your experience? You know, were you always aware of modern monetary theory? You start following these, you know, economists that are kind of not the mainstream way of thinking. Were you always aware of modern monetary theory? And how was that experience for you, kind of listening and learning from them?
Yeah, no, great question. And no, I definitely was not always aware of it. I think I come from more of an environmental background, so I was kind of starting to question, I think, mainstream economics and some of their assumptions. I was naturally a little bit skeptical of, namely their kind of assertion that we can have limitless growth on a finite planet. That was my first kind of entree into being like, have they thought this through, or is that correct? And what does that mean? And so I found ecological economics. I found some of these other heterodox schools, sometimes they're called. And eventually, I'm happy to see now this synthesis between ecological economics and MMT, because I do think ecological economics had a little better understanding than the mainstream, perhaps. But now they're really kind of integrating MMT, or at least some of them, right? And saying, oh, this money piece is really kind of the piece we've been missing for many, many years. And it just kind of makes it a more cohesive, they can have a more cohesive understanding of the functioning of the economy, right? The functioning of the monetary system, and therefore how the economy could, provide well-being, more well-being, and human and planetary well-being for all, to make a more cohesive view. But the way I found MMT was, this kind of circuitous path through ecological economics and public banking. And then eventually someone said, hey, have you heard of this, small group called MMT out of Kansas City? And I said, no. But once I dug into what they were saying, it just kind of grabbed me, and I just kept reading more and more because it seemed really dramatic. There was like this debate going on. This small group is saying, oh no, actually the mainstream has missed these vital observations. And they're actually, saying things that are maybe the reverse of how MMT posits, that tries to describe how the monetary system actually works. And so I said, well, this has big repercussions, or this is important if mainstream economics is perhaps getting some of these fundamental assumptions incorrect. So I wanted to dig into that, right? Not only because there was conflict and controversy that was kind of juicy and dramatic, but also because the implications are so important, right? Or the stakes are pretty high in terms of our understanding of what the national debt is, and therefore if it's an obstacle, or how we can have a better understanding of the real limits to government spending, and therefore like what we can achieve as a society when we're thinking about our big challenges like climate change or inequality, or if we can just build a better society, basically. It comes down to these questions around money and role of government, and just really understanding if we have the tools to achieve some of our goals. Therefore, like what the obstacles are, what the real obstacles are, but also what are the possibilities. So, we can get into that in a more tangible way, but MMT starts to address these big picture questions, and that's what really attracted me to the story and the characters. And so all of that just came together and made me feel like this has to be a movie and told in that kind of story format, right?
Okay. And what I love the most about MMT, Maren, was that it's so accessible. Even if you don't care about economics, it's so captivating. You're so intrigued into the story. You just want to know more. And you haven't filled it with loads of technical terms, and it's not a bunch of economists just blabbing on about the economy. The everyday person, your everyday person, is going to watch that film and feel, oh my gosh, I've been lied to my whole life. Oh my gosh, public debt perhaps isn't so bad. And you've just shattered so many, you broke down what people believe in. And it's just while also captivating and engaging with people who might not understand economics. And I think that's what's so impactful about Finding the Money. And I just can't wait to see it released. I mean, when it first came out, when we watched the premiere, we were so excited to go and see it. And honestly, it just blew away our expectations. And you guys just did such a, honestly, fantastic job with the film. And I can't wait to see the impact it makes. But
Thank you.
on that note, I just wanted to ask you, because in the film, Stephanie Kelton, she says first you ignore it and then you ridicule it. And I just was intrigued to hear about some of the pushbacks you experienced personally while filming. I'm sure you got into contact with lots of economists, and perhaps some weren't so keen on speaking to you. Some were just very dismissive. But yeah, what were your experiences?
Yeah, great question. And, that's definitely what I was trying to find out, like through the course of making the film and talking to economists, kind of what we were talking about, how could it be that this small group, was trying to shatter these paradigms, or, shatter what we've kind of grown up believing about the national debt, and just really kind of flip it upside down, honestly. And so, I was always trying to discover by talking to mainstream economists, because they're MMT is labeled as crazy and crackpot theory, and don't listen to those people, they're obviously wrong. They think, right, they're kind of the mainstream position is that MMT says you can print infinite amounts of money and never cause inflation, or it's kind of the theory is so much talked about or characterized in a way that is incorrect, so that the debate is not really a good debate that's happening, unfortunately. It's so my whole goal was to say, okay, just tell me where MMT goes wrong, right? So you say it's wrong, just show me where. Just say this is what they say and this is where it goes wrong, right? On the accounting level, on the operations level, because MMT posits that they're just trying to describe accurately how the monetary system functions in the UK, in the US, elsewhere. And of course, they can describe the differences between the US system and the UK system and the Euro system, and what those differences then imply for policy or fiscal space, right? But their position, they're just trying to describe how the system works, right? That's their first job. And then, it can go from there. But so I was always trying to say, okay, well, if they're wrong, if you say these people are crazy, just tell me why, just show me on the accounting level, how are dollars accounted for, how are bonds issued, and what happens, between the Fed and the Treasury, or between, the Bank of England. How do the operations occur? What's the order of operations in terms of spending and taxing? How does this look on the balance sheet? And so when I tried to dig into that level, I talked to the biggest breadth of economists that I could, from the left to the right, who all kind of disagreed or dismissed MMT, right? And I just couldn't find someone who could give me a good, valid critique, who actually grappled with the MMT literature, who said this is where they go wrong. And the MMT economists themselves, they've put their papers out there, they've put their literature out there for years, and said, please disprove us. This is how science progresses. You put forward a theory, a hypothesis, and if it can be disproven, then you can keep going. But they said, no one has yet been able to, I think, validly disprove the theory, right? You hear critiques, but they're not super valid, because they're critiquing a straw man, right? Or they're critiquing this thing that MMT economists didn't actually say. So it's a tricky debate, and it's kind of frustrating in that way. But for me, I think through the interviews, it was still incredibly enlightening to see where the divergence comes from, and try to trace back kind of where the core of the disagreement is. And so I think you see that in the Jared Bernstein interview. You see that with David Walker, the government, he was the head of the government accounting office, so kind of the top accountant in the United States for many years, in the Hall of Fame, and having, he's testified in front of Congress more than anyone else, let's say, according to him, 350 times. So as the top accountant of the United States, when I asked him, how is cash dollars that we hold in our pocket, like, how is that accounted for on the government's balance sheet? If you go to the Fed's website, you can see it's accounted for as a liability of the Federal Reserve, right? Cash, Federal Reserves, they're liabilities of the Fed, which is part of the federal government. So he said, no, they're not accounted for as liabilities. They're not, and he's the top accountant. You easily go to the Fed's website and it shows you the Fed's balance
funny.
sheet right
In the
there.
movie, right after he says that, you show that you go on the website and you show exactly that it is a liability.
Yeah, so it's like, it's that fundamental accounting knowledge, right? The MMT tries to say, they're just doing the accounting in a way, and showing that balance sheets balance, showing, there's kind of this reveal of, what they call the sector balance graph, which shows that there is a balance happening here. There's two sides to a balance sheet. Someone's liability, and in this case, the liability of the government is always an asset of somebody else, right? So cash, dollars, money that we know is recorded as a debt or a liability of the federal government, and it's recorded and held by us, everyone else, taxpayers, as assets or credits. Money, like our money, our savings. So not only is the national debt not our debt, the taxpayers' debt, it's literally the opposite. It's literally our money, our savings. So that's what's so interesting. And I'm like, how did that accounting get missed? Or how how is that basic? It's just somehow that's not covered in the textbooks. And I think you could see with Jared Bernstein that just, he hadn't been asked that question before, if you've seen the film, but he hadn't been asked that question. It's not taught in the textbooks. And so that's just where the divergence comes from. Anyway, in the film, I spend a lot of time kind of looking into the nature of money, the history of money, because I do think that's where the divergence comes from. Like the core, I believe, is the story we tell about money. There's a story that's told in the economics textbooks that money is something that exists like out in nature almost. It's the gold story, it's the barter story. I think it's really the free market story, as I would call it, is that they want money to be to have evolved from and come from the private market outside of government, right? Like they really want to relegate government from any role in this origin story of money. And so I think that's where it comes from, is this idea that, they want the private market to be kind of supreme and this all natural, all balancing force that will function better and provide well-being for the majority better if the government is hands-off and small and unregulated. It's this whole project, right? It's the whole neoliberal project that is somehow very built into the core of mainstream economics. And I think if they start questioning that core, start questioning the nature of money, where it comes from, if the government plays a role in issuing and creating this important contract, is what, money is really a legal contract, then, we start to see, well, maybe government has an important role in kind of shaping and getting the whole monetary system, the whole market system going to begin with. And in that case, it makes us shift our whole perspective around, I think, role of government in the economy, what's possible, and then really their responsibility to shape and create the best economy and market that we can towards the objectives that we want, without just saying, oh, this is the way it has to be. This is the way the market functions. This is natural. Don't try and change it because you'll just make it worse. It's really this idea that there is no alternative, right? This TINA. So yeah, for me, it's just like that traces back to the story, to this misunderstanding. And so the debate is really kind of comes down to the nature of money itself. Is it a real thing? Is it an object? Is it a commodity? Or is it an accounting fact, and really an organizing tool created and issued by governments to move real resources, not being a real resource itself. So I can go on and on, but stop me.
Is that something you expected when you went to meet these top government economists? Did you expect what you got? I mean, in the movie, there's that clip that went viral with that economist who's thinking, well, wait, is that how it works? A little bit. He gets perplexed by the question is, if the government prints their own money, why do they borrow? And he gets so perplexed by that, as if he doesn't even understand certain concepts. Is that something you expected?
But I think it's so good that you guys challenge these economists, because if you think about it, MMT isn't even that radical. It's an empirical observation. You're simply saying what happens in real life. and they call you these ultra left crackpots theorists. It's not even really a theory, is it? You're just literally observing what's happening, and because you're telling people about it, you're suddenly these radicals who are trying to take down the system. And it's just, to me, it's quite absurd. And
I know,
yeah,
it's fascinating. Yeah, it's fascinating. I was always shocked by, yeah, like the extreme reaction. I was, I thought, oh, okay, economists should say, oh yeah, maybe we missed this and we should rewrite our textbooks now, or, let's integrate this into our field. But no, like the resistance is very strong, right? And that, I think that comes down to, just humans, but also, who knows, maybe the field of economics seems to be extremely rigid in that way, right? And extremely immune to questioning, I think, on that level, and not wanting to change any of their Econ 101 core, right? They say, if you start questioning those really fundamental assumptions too, then it's like, it's almost a house of cards, right? If you're plucking out the foundations, what about all the rest of this that's built on top of it? They don't want to lose the whole project, I think. So they're invested, right? And they're invested personally. If you've devoted decades of your life to this and taught it, and you write the textbooks and you advise the presidents, it's very hard to go back and change and say, oh, maybe I got, a few kind of key important things wrong here, not just some little things, right? So it's hard to go back and admit that, I think, just on a human level. But yeah, like in terms of what I was expecting from these interviews, yeah, I really didn't know. So it's like, I've got to ask these questions, or I didn't even know how to posit the question, it just kind of came out that way. And I wish I could have asked more and more economists this, because the crux of it is what's going on. And so the thing is, that the clip with Jared Bernstein, who is the chief economic advisor of President Joe Biden right now, and has been with him for a long time, is important, because I don't think it's an aberration. Like his reaction, I think, was actually fairly emblematic and fairly insightful of the mainstream field of what's told in the textbooks, right? So he hadn't encountered that in the textbooks. And what's important is that he hadn't asked himself, and he hadn't been asked that question before. Like you could see that, right? Like you could see that in the interview. I could see that when I asked the question, like he hadn't grappled with that. It's just never been brought up, and it seems so core, so important, that we should ask those kind of simple, almost childlike fundamental questions. But it's almost shunned in economics, I think, to ask those kind of basic questions, right? So I think, for students and for others, don't be afraid to ask basic questions, especially when you have some, your intuition is guiding you somewhere else. Don't be afraid to ask, and you'll get some interesting answers maybe. But I think, yeah, so I think that interview was emblematic. I think, I've heard stories of similar things that just weren't on camera, or, and through other interviews, I got similar impressions as well that just didn't, or similar answers that didn't make it into the film, or, not exactly, but so the reason I put it in there was because it wasn't an aberration. I believe it is more emblematic of the mainstream field of economics trying to grapple with this. And some people will say Jared Bernstein doesn't actually have a PhD in economics, but I think, he's the top economist of the United States, and he calls himself a trained economist. So whatever his, degree is in, I don't believe it would be any different if he had it's very similar for anyone who does have a PhD in the field of economics. But yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and also we mentioned before, or you mentioned before, that MMT, is related to, environmental aspirations, because one of the, main connections MMT has is with the Green New Deal. And with many of these projects that people have, the question is, how are we going to fund it? How are we going to fund it? That's really what a big part of what MMT says. It's like, hey, funding it is not the problem, right? As Stephanie Kelton says, finding the money, the title of the movie is not the issue, right? The issue is like, yeah, we need to be careful. There's inflation, but we can fund these projects. And going back to what Dara was saying about the pushback, do you think MMT's connection with the Green New Deal is the reason why there's like so much pushback, like, and you're seen as these like lefties, do you think that connection could be the reason?
Yeah, definitely. It's a double-edged sword, right? Because MMTs existed much before the Green New Deal and what was never environmentally focused from the beginning, right? Their whole goal at the beginning was just describe the monetary system, right? And the environment was not really part of their core, mission, right? They weren't environmental activists, let's say. But the Green New Deal came along 2019, and AOC, in conjunction with releasing the Green New Deal, she was asked, how are you going to pay for it? And she had become recently familiar with MMT, and she mentioned that word, right? She mentioned the word MMT once, and it just kind of exploded in the mainstream media in the US and internationally around that time, beginning of 2019, which is also around the time I began shooting the film. But so it's very interesting that that's when they got, a lot more media attention and attraction. And so it's a double-edged sword in that way, right? Because they're trying to get out there, especially to the general public, but then they're kind of getting out there in a way that's always controversial, and because news, you need a hook, you need a provocative hook, that sort of thing. So there's controversy built in there in terms of how they were spreading, I think, awareness of MMT. But I think you're always going to struggle with that. Like, how do you get out a message that's a little bit provocative without causing some controversy, right? So I think the Green New Deal, it's just, they are definitely associated with it. A lot of their economists, care about the environment, and are focusing as well on showing, how you could resource something like the transition that's envisioned with the Green New Deal, which is a large transition of the economy with the goal to, tackle the climate crisis while providing and improving well-being, economic well-being for the majority of people, right? So like, that's a big goal. I think that seems like it would be the goal of any economy, right? Is to, like, if we want to step back and say, what is the economy for? Like, why have we created this thing, right? It's not a force of nature. If we go back to that premise, we invented the economy to just decide, like, and it's a set of choices of how we produce and distribute the resources that a society needs to survive. And if we want to survive and thrive, then we might need to realize that we need to live on a livable planet, and we want to provide well-being. Like, maybe that should be just a pretty rational goal of any economy, of any society, through their organizational structures, however you want to call that. We call it government at the moment, right? So yeah, I guess I would just say, seems fairly rational. If that's your democratic goal, to tackle the climate crisis and improve human well-being, then maybe this is how we could do it. Like, this is how we could mobilize these resources and do this in a way that's successful by preventing inflation, right? It's like, if you have a goal, and MMT will say, they're kind of nonpartisan in a way. They say, yeah, if your goal is World War III, you can do it this way. If your goal is Green New Deal, saving humanity, you can do it this way. So they're pretty nonpartisan in that way, in that they just say, depends what your democratic goal is, but the monetary system is how you achieve it, right? And the monetary system is how the government can think about a big mobilization. So the best example we unfortunately have is World War II, but Green New Deal, would be towards a goal of, instead of, destruction, it would be a goal of building and preserving our real resources and improving people's livelihoods, right? And so it's how do you mobilize those resources, which means, how do you shift labor? How do you train new workers to do other things? How do you invest heavily in green and electric infrastructure and public transportation, and public health care and housing? How do you tackle all that food while preventing inflation? And so MMT can give you a better roadmap, can give policymakers a better toolkit for how they can achieve that successfessly, because it will be very unsuccessful, right? If you just start throwing money at something and not worrying about inflation, or right, inflation is your limit, but that's linked to real resources very much. So you have to be looking at your real resources. And then if you're caring about planetary boundaries, you have to be looking at those real boundaries as well. So I think that's, those are the real limits, and that should change. Like, where I would hope, it's really not included in the film, but where I would hope that would get us, or where MMT, I think, would shift things of how we organize government budgeting, right? Like, this is kind of the crux of it, I think, is how would an MMT kind of economic system work differently, or how, MMT aware politicians, how would that government budget? And it's kind of a subtle shift from saying, how are you going to pay for it to how are you going to resource it? Seems very subtle, but it's actually quite different, I think, in a lot of ways. But let's say, you have different spending priorities. Let's say you want to spend to do things like ecological restoration or climate spending, where we say, okay, we're going to spend something that looks like a lot of dollars on the budget, but it's not a lot of resources. Spending the dollars to hire people who are unemployed to restore fisheries and wetlands and forests. So you're restoring and growing and replenishing all these real resources. You're spending some dollars, but what does that look like on the real resource budget? Seems to me like that kind of spending should sail through Congress, sail through Parliament, to say this kind of spending is very affordable, right? It's very resource affordable. So it should, instead of today, like that's the first thing on the chopping block would be environmental restoration, ecological restoration, that those kind of dollars, like, oh, we can't afford, that's a lot of money, right? But I'm like, yeah, but that's not what's important, right? What's important is our real collective resources. If this money, this is just a tool that really directs our energy towards replenishing our real resources, why would we not do it?
Yeah. Right, there's a real distinction between money and resources. That's made clear in the film.
Yeah. So it's just like, how could we budget? Like, so we have something called the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office in the US, that analyzes any new spending legislation, right? So let's say today, all the CBO does is analyzes whether this new spending, how many dollars that will add to the debt or the deficit over time, and how you should offset that with taxes or whatever, with the goal to limit adding to the debt. So that's the only thing they tell Congress, is just dollar for dollar, but they never look at the inflationary impact of that spending, where that spending is going, whether that sector already has inflation potential, is already, at the brink of being, kind of at its capacity, or, is that spending really utilizing underutilized resources currently, and there's a lot more room to spend over here than there is over here. So I just think CBO needs to be a lot more nuanced in their analysis, right? They can't just say dollar for dollar, this adds to the debt and that's all that matters. It's like they need to be analyzing what's the inflationary potential of this specific spending. If it's on healthcare, if it's on transportation, if it's on defense, those have different inflationary impacts. And that's what we need to be looking at. And then how do you offset those, right? What kind of taxes or what kind of offsets do you need to put in place to prevent the inflation potential of that spending, right? And so if you're looking at healthcare, let's say if you're looking at, we need to provide, more doctor visits, more dentist visits for the population, or certain things like that, then how do you, maybe you have a shortage of doctors and nurses and their wages would get pushed up, if you're trying to provide more healthcare. Well, maybe the way to offset that, or the way to prevent inflation there, would be to say, we need to build in additional funding to train more doctors and nurses. Maybe that's our offset in a way. Like we need to, so that needs to be built into the spending, to say, like, this is how we're going to prevent inflation here, is we can train this many doctors and nurses to, maybe shift them from this to here, or they're unemployed and we're going to train them to this. So, thinking about it that way, I think is very different than the way we do it today, right? And so I just think that has a lot of implications, not only for climate spending, for how we can do things more efficiently on a societal level. Just to give some concrete examples, I'm thinking of healthcare, transportation,
right.
To get, right, like you guys, luckily you have the NHS, right? And like, I just hate to see a lot of the debate happening right now in the UK, where the new Labour government that you finally got, right, it seems to be obsessed with the debt, or this black hole, or how are they going to find the money to, improve or the NHS, or they're looking at cutting social spending, right? Because the only reason being the national debt, right? They're so concerned, their debt to GDP ratio. They're not necessarily thinking about inflation in this instance, right? So it's like, look at the US, like what have we done with our healthcare system? We spend 18% of our GDP on our healthcare system. And we have some of the worst health outcomes in the developed world, right? Just some of the worst metrics of longevity and health and that sort of thing. But So, we look at this inefficiency that's built in. We have a private healthcare system. So much of that spending goes to middlemen, it goes to administration, the people that are trying to prevent you from getting care. The NHS is just it's a more efficient system. Like, we could more efficiently, if we have a one-payer system, single-payer system, a Medicare for all type system, the analysis shows we'd be spending much less overall in society, maybe 15, maybe, I think UK spends more like 10% maybe of GDP. Like, the more like normal developed countries spend, the next closest would be 12% GDP. US is at 18% GDP. So we could get down, maybe the US could get down to 15% on Medicare for all if talking total spending. So yes, that's scary because it's on the government's balance sheet. So anytime that's brought up in a debate, it's like, that costs $33 trillion. Like, how are we going to pay for that? Medicare for all is so expensive on the government's balance sheet. But I'm like, no, step back, look at total spending in the economy, total overall societal spending. Medicare for all is more efficient, right? It's less total spending in the economy, which means less inflationary pressure. You're using less resources. So that's how we need to be analyzing it, not scared that it's on the government's balance sheet, right? Saying this is more efficient for society overall. I think that works with healthcare. I think that works in a lot of other sectors, like essential sectors, maybe public transportation. Public transportation costs society less overall than the car system that we have today, of tons of resources and money going into car infrastructure and highways and car maintenance and everything that goes into cars, right? So we can just think on a societal level, what's a more efficient use of resources?
Yeah, and I think it's so relevant in the UK right now. I mean, the UK have focused for years about austerity, and we have to watch the deficit. And instead of just watching the cost, perhaps we should look at the cost of not investing in the money. I mean, we're behind on productivity and in growth. And it's like, guys, let's just look at the cost of not investing, and lagging in these metrics clearly is linked to this skepticism of not spending money. And I think we've really suffered for having this attitude and outlook on the public deficit. So it's so good finding the money is coming out right now, because I think people in this country really need to watch it and take on this viewpoint, because perhaps it could really serve us well in the future.
Right. Yeah, I think especially when you voted for you voted for labor, you want to improve the situation for workers. You want to improve environment and make climate investments and make the society better for the future. But you're told you can't, right? You have this obstacle, or sorry, we just can't find the money. We have this national debt. So even though we all want to do this, we just somehow can't. And I think, we need MMT to show us the tools for how we can accomplish some of those goals, that there are alternative ways to organize economies, that we don't have to just say, oh, we need, I guess Rachel Reeves is saying, we just need foreign investors. We need businesses to invest because the government doesn't have any money. Well, that's very different incentives, right? Very different incentives that are going on there than when the government can say, we're running things for nonprofit, and we're running things with a different metric of success. Our metric of success is improving life for people. And those are all worthy goals that we can achieve through our budgeting system to, improve people's lives, not just looking at what's, profit created for private businesses. That's not analogous to improving our lives necessarily.
You mentioned you started the movie in 2019, so now it's been almost like 5 years. And this why'd you laugh? Was it a long journey?
Yeah, it was a painful 5 years, but yes, okay.
But so this movie, it introduces and talks about MMT, but it's also a story about this woman, Stephanie Kelton, who is kind of fighting for this new idea and also fighting for people to really understand and listen to her. Like, she has this powerful scene. I remember she says, if you give me 30 minutes, people will start listening. If you give me an hour, I'll start convincing. And if you give me 2 hours, I'm usually set, And so I want to ask you, how was it, following Stephanie Kelton, who seems kind of the main character in this documentary, and, how was it following her, and who is she kind of as a person to kind of be so dedicated and to fight so much for this idea?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question because, yeah, she takes a ton of flack, right? I mean, I have a lot of respect for her. Like you were saying, you know, it's they ignore you, then they laugh at you and ridicule you, and then they fight you. So it's like she is taking on a lot of that, right? And you see it on social media on a daily basis in her you know, careful if you want to read her comments on Twitter because they're not all very nice, right? So I think you know, you're asking if I got some of that, and yeah, I think it's just kind of built in for some reason. People are very emotionally invested in their economics, in their economic theories. So, and money, it's like people are, it's a scary subject, right? And Randy said that in the film too. It's like, don't talk about money. It's scary. So I think for Stephanie, you know, I'm always amazed that she can take on so much of that and also kind of repulse that ridicule. Or and I think also I was trying to convey that in the film. There's one scene where she says like, yeah, you know, it's hard, like we've made a lot of sacrifices, or especially in our professional careers, you know, they're not at Ivy League schools maybe where they could be if they had just followed, you know, the mainstream neoclassical models, but they really kind of sacrificed some of that to say, well, you know, she came across these ideas from Warren Mosler. She thought, she was skeptical of them. She thought they sounded wrong. So she set out, you know, she couldn't forget about it. So she set out to prove him wrong and show where he went wrong, right? What I was looking for as well. And she couldn't do it, right? Like through the process of talking to the Fed and the Treasury, she actually ended up validating what he said. And once you have your eyes opened in that way, I guess for a lot of humans, you know, it's hard to go back and close your eyes, maybe. Like Warren Mosler will say, yeah, once you see it, it's very hard to unsee it. So I think maybe that's what happened to her. Maybe she, you know, she saw it, she couldn't unsee it, and then she's just kind of devoted her career to this, for better or for worse. You know, I think she takes a lot of flack, but she's, you know, she's not the one who invented these ideas, right? Or she's not exactly an originator. She originated some of the early papers on the subject. But right, we see Warren Mosler and Randy and Bill Mitchell before her, but she's really been able to, I think, synthesize and communicate these ideas to the general public in a way that no one has before. And so that's really such an important role. It's such an important role for her, right, to communicate these ideas to the general public. Because although MMT, you know, maybe they originally thought it would be much easier to get accepted by the mainstream field of economics, I think they quickly realized that wasn't happening, that it was very hard for them to take that path through the academic literature. And she'll say in the film too, you know, you write a journal article, you wait 2 years for it to get published. And in the meantime, you know, we're having these really important debates in the political sphere about the national debt, or, you know, this debt ceiling, or your black hole, or, you know, you see these repercussions playing out in real life, or 2000, you know, the 2008 recession, like they were just watching as Obama kept saying, we don't have any money, we have to tighten our belts just like everyone else. We can't, sorry, like the government can't step in here, even though we're in this terrible recession. Sorry, we can't, you know, help people. We can't employ people. We can't invest in climate infrastructure at this time when they actually had the most space to spend and invest, right? So I think that would be very frustrating if you've kind of seen that, and then you see what's playing out in the political sphere, the debate that continues to play out based on these kind of myths. So I think, yeah, just on a personal level, she felt like it was so important to reach that general public because the change wasn't happening from within or from the top down. Like they just think that even though, you know, it's silly that kind of the outside has to say to economics, to this field, like, hey, maybe you guys are missing some things or getting some fundamentals wrong. MMT economists feel like it has to come, the pressure needs to come a little more from the outside, from the grassroots, to say, you know, we're not really going to put up with this anymore, and demand more from our politicians, and really just allow our politicians to talk about this in an open way. Because so far they can't really talk about it without getting laughed off the stage, right? They're not taken seriously. The serious economists will say, you know, oh, that's ridiculous, you know, that's crackpot theory. So don't, you know, can't even talk about that. But the idea would be to just open up that discourse so that we can have a better debate, right? Like right now we're kind of debating the wrong things. Let's come over here and debate what any new spending package, if it might add to inflation, or, you know, how much it uses our real resources. And if it doesn't, you know, if there's some spending we can pass that doesn't have inflationary pressure and stands to really improve our lives, like, why aren't we passing it? You know, I think that would be frustrating. Why are we leaving all these people unemployed who really want to work, you know, who want to contribute, who have, you know, labor to contribute? And over here, we have so much work to get done in society. We need to care for people. We need to care for the environment. And yet we're leaving all these people who want to work unemployed involuntarily. It seems quite unnecessary. And I think MMT would show that it is, that it's not a money issue. So, you know, it's like seeing this mismatch. How can we just have a better debate about what spending we can afford, what we could pass today without paying for it, without tax offsets necessarily, which, you know, are difficult, right? Or what spending is a priority enough that we need to figure out how to offset it, or where to find those resources elsewhere, or maybe push down spending in this part of the economy, or maybe in the private sector, having to minimize some things happening in the private sector so we can prioritize something important in the public sector. So yeah, I think it's still all about, right, like budgeting more responsibly. So it's, you know, you say they sound so radical, but the ironic thing is, you know, Stephanie herself, she's not, you can see in the film, she's not very radical. Like, she's very, I find, very middle of the road, you know, very rational, saying, yeah, we just want government to budget more responsibly, because today they don't take into consideration inflation risk. So she's saying, just take into consideration inflation risk, like, be more responsible. Take into consideration planetary boundaries, take into consideration real resources, and then that also shows where you may have room to spend already. So yeah, she's not too radical, I'd say.
But Maren, you said it was a very painful 5 years. Would you share with us why it was so painful, and from its inception to now in 2024, what have some of the changes been? What have some of the impacts you've seen, and was it worth it?
I don't know. I mean, I'm very glad I got it done, and people like you, it was worth it, I think, have gotten to see it. So yeah, I've gotten some very nice feedback as well. But yeah, it was just a torturous process, you know. It takes a long time. Editing takes a lot. It was so hard to edit this film, and I'm learning a lot on the way. You know, it's the first film I've directed, so it's very, that was, I think, the hard part was, yeah, funding it, you know, figuring everything out, shooting and editing, and so it was just, you know, it's a process that I was just like, you know, got to get it done, because I see that it's, you know, kind of politically relevant and wanting to get the film out there, right? But I was just working as hard as I could to get it out as quick as I could. But that was the hard process, I guess, was just trying to get it done in a timely manner when it's such a kind of behemoth of a story. So that was just hard to figure out, let alone just kind of the legal business, you know, side of things, and raising money and investor, you know, like that. Not my cup of tea, really. But yeah, so yeah. But I'm glad, yeah, and I'm very glad that, you know, we can finally get it out in the UK and the rest of the world. So it's been a bit of a journey that way too, in terms of just the documentary field right now. The market is very rough, right? Like, documentaries aren't selling, their streamers aren't buying. So it's very, like, the distribution machinery just isn't there to help independent films get out there. So, you know, back in the day, 10 years ago or so, like, it would have been a much easier sell, or maybe we would have been on Netflix, or we would have been, you know, wherever.
Like, this is a movie that could be on Netflix for sure.
I thought it should have been on Netflix. I was waiting for it.
You knock on their door, because they're not buying. They're just not buying. They're not. Yeah. I know, it's pretty tragic. They're not buying independent films anymore right now, and they don't have, like, look at their documentary lineup. It's not super exciting in my, you know, they've really cut back. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons, but we're really kind of in this low point for documentary film at the moment.
We're trying to find the money for finding the money.
Yeah, it's a challenge. So it's going to be very grassroots. Yeah, like, so hopefully doing stuff like this, like, I don't know how we're going to spread it. We have to get on social media more, or what, like, that's kind of our only opportunities here, is like social media or any earned media we can get. But it's hard to just spread the word these days. There's a lot out there, right? There's a lot of content out there as well.
But if you're releasing it on, like, Vimeo and stuff like that, how does the movie end up making money, or the documentary end up making money?
Well, Vimeo right now, it'll be for rent or buy. So So that will be monetary. But yeah, so since we're first releasing it, you know, it's like rent or purchase, and that's where it is in the US still. It's still in that kind of rental purchase phase, and it's on the what they call on-demand platforms here, like Apple and Amazon and YouTube.
I think YouTube does that too, right?
Yeah, so you can rent or buy there, and hopefully we'll get there soon in the UK and Australia and elsewhere, like other territories. We have a lot of translations, you know, foreign translations coming in too. So as many translations as we can get, you know, yeah, the more people we can reach on Vimeo at least. But yeah, everything's broken up into territories. So we're just trying to get out there as much as we can to rent or buy, and then eventually, definitely the hope is to be free on YouTube or some other platform that's what they call ad supported. So maybe we'll have to watch a few ads, but we can monetize it a little bit, right? Because again, we still haven't really filled our budget. So it is very tricky, like for some reason, to monetize a film.
Well, hey, Netflix started putting ads on their subscription, so.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's going back to that, you know, it kind of went to the streaming model. Now it's going back to this, I think, ad supported model. So yeah, you deal with it.
Was producing the film, was it tumultuous because of what you were pushing, or because it's just, you know, to do what you're doing, it is extremely hard? Do you feel it was because of what you're pushing?
Yeah, for sure. I think both. I think you ask any filmmaker, it's really hard no matter what. But then I think economics is hard. It's like a hard, you know, people's eyes glaze over when you start talking about money and economics. It's like hard. It's a hard sell that this will be an entertaining story or entertaining film, right? It's not like clearly like a clear story. But for me, it seemed clear in my mind. I was like, this should be a film because there's conflict, right? And that's a good story, is conflict and controversy. And then just the fact that the stakes and the implications are quite high. I just always, you know, that's what draws me, is like, is this important? Is this something we need to know? Like, does this have an impact in our world? And that's why I made the film, you know, because I just thought it's such an important, you know, this money piece is just, if we don't get that, so much builds upon that. You know, all these other things I care about, we're debating in politics, from healthcare to the environment to homelessness to anything, you know, we're talking about that, and it always goes back to the money question. And so I'm just like, we got to address this before we can have better debates over here. Before I can make a film about this or that I'm interested in, you know, I thought we've got to tackle this first. So I was always trying to get to like the core, this, you know, these kind of this important systemic level, this root level that we need to address, so that we can more, I think, effectively or quickly get to all these, you know, maybe solve a lot of these other issues by getting to the core of it, right?
How was the MMT world, or these economists, you know, Stephanie Kelton, kind of the Avengers of the MMT? What was their reaction when you said you wanted to make a movie on what they're working on?
Yeah, I think it varied a lot. I think at the time they were all of a sudden getting a lot of media attention in 2019, and I had met some of them right before that. So it was kind of like I was coming along just the same time a lot of journalists were coming along, asking for their time. And so, yeah, it was a little hard to get time with Stephanie at first, right? Because she was in such high demand. But somehow she luckily just, you know, some persistence, and she agreed to let me come film with her. I think, you know, of course, not really knowing what it would evolve to be. And I didn't really know what it would evolve to be exactly, right? When you first start shooting, you just can't really know. And you can't predict what's happening in the real world. But so I think, yeah, a lot, they're always open, like, right? That's the interesting thing about them, is they're happy to talk to the press or journalists, and they're just saying, yeah, this is what we've been working on. This is our work. This is what we believe in, and we're happy to share about it, and to try to correct the record or correct some misunderstandings that are out there, right? So they're always looking, I think, for those opportunities. But I think there's a lot of skepticism too, right? Because they're so often they get covered, and like, you know, they talk to journalists for an hour, and then the article gets printed, and they're like, like they're representing it wrong, you know, or somehow they missed this, or they, you know, the article didn't come out in the way they wanted, maybe, or because it's a complicated subject sometimes, and the nuance gets lost when a journalist sometimes translates it into their own language or translates it for an audience. In that translation, somehow it maybe got shifted to being slightly incorrect, right? So they're always kind of dealing with that, but so So they have to be wary as well. And Stephanie is wary and tries to be, careful about who she talks to and how and that sort of thing. So they have to be cautious, but they're also very open and willing to try to correct misunderstandings. So, but I think, they had no idea what the film was going to be. They probably didn't think it was ever going to get done because people have come to them before, and not finished things. But so if I was them, yeah, I would probably not invest too much in it and not assume that it would get done. But I think they're happy with it now in the end, that it's out. So yeah. But I still look at my position as being fairly independent of I'm not an MMT economist. I'm not, I'm just kind of coming at this from the outside as a filmmaker, trying to understand it for myself, as a general lay audience would do. Of course, I dug into it for more years and had to really grapple with all these things myself, maybe more than a journalist who's writing one article would have the chance to do.
Yeah, because you've worked also previously on other films, even though this is the first movie you said that you produced, but you worked on other films. I saw Enemies of the State, United States versus Reality Winner, right? One is about, a documentary, an anonymous hacker, the anonymous, the group Anonymous. Yeah. And then another one was, again, I think, kind of like Edward Snowden, but someone who released secrets, was working on the NSA. So these also have a common theme of talking about the government. We're talking about government secrecy. We're talking about national security. Very involved with the government, and then now you're doing this thing with finding the money, which is like, does the government even understand economics? So how, working on these movies, how has that changed your perception of the government, if it has changed it at all?
Yeah, and I think, and again, those films, like I didn't really have any say in the subject matter for those films. I was really just like an associate producer, so I was just there to get experience and to work on films from the beginning to the end. Just getting my hands dirty, doing, helping with filming to different levels of stages of production there. So I didn't actually have influence or anything over the subject matter for those films. And so I think they are a little different than my subject area of interest. So yeah, those are more kind of national security focused. But they're related in a little way, this kind of skepticism of government, which I think is healthy. But I also, it's like, yeah, we're always, we have to hold our governments accountable. But I very much believe that, ideally the government in a democratic system is just us, and we need, we're responsible for making it better if it's not functioning as it should be today. And so I think, yeah, we always need to hold government accountable. We need to prevent secrets and all of that. But I think, yeah, we, like, in the end, government is created by us, for us, and should be carrying out what we want it to do, right? And its mission should be just improving our lives and ensuring we have a healthy, livable planet to continue to thrive on. So I would hope that in a democratic system that it would function to for those results. But unfortunately, yeah, we really have to look at our systems of governance today and how they've been captured by maybe the wealthiest interests. We very much see that legislation that's passed is almost always in line with what the 1% wants, very unusually aligned with what the 99% wants. And so that's a failure, I think a failure of democracy right now, that we don't really have that representation. And so there's a lot we should look at in terms of, improving governance. And that's politics. And, in a way, I think, yeah, it's tied. And what I always say is, economics really is politics in the end. Economics is, again, not this system of natural laws that we just can kind of observe, but it's all created and decided by us through politics. So politics is super important. And I think, it's how we decide everything. So yes, we can improve how politics functions, how our governance system functions. We can improve democracy, we can improve representation. And we need to be doing that and thinking about all that, especially, but then also understanding what our limits and possibilities are. So better governance, but I guess I look at that as a slightly different story. But I think having a vision and saying like, we can, things can be better. Like, I think economists' main job is to tell us things can't be better. You can't change it. This is the best it can be. The rich are going to get richer and the poor are going to get poorer, and there's nothing you can do about it. So don't even try. And I think like just opening that up and saying it can be better. Like we have, like, we're the richest society in the history of the planet, like things can be better. Like we can have a little more distributed benefit here. We could all work less and have the same quality of life if we had organized things a little differently, right? Like there are options. We had options. We still have options. So things don't have to be the way they are. And I think that's just an important message, that economics is not a natural, it's not this natural inevitability. It's all political choices. So we do have to be involved in politics, however flawed it is, but trying to improve, I think, that system, being aware that that's where the power is,
And I think we bolster our democracy by making economics more accessible. People make better choices. They have further understanding of important topics instead of these elites keeping it away from the general public and not having discussions. So that is the beauty of finding the money. You're making economics and the topic of money just more accessible, because people couldn't even believe that government spending is actually a prerequisite for taxation. They think it's the other way around. They need our taxes, and that's one of the things the film kept on drumming on about.
I think that's one of the biggest kind of
takeaways, I think, and one of the most important lessons. And I hope people really do take to this new film. But I think it's one that will just age with time. It will become more relevant as the years go on, as the climate becomes more of an issue, even though it should be an urgent one right now. So I just truly believe this will just be one that will age with time as the years go on.
Well, let's hope. Thank you. I know, but yeah, time to get it out there and running. But yeah, I mean, so far it's not taking off all by itself. So I'm like, okay, I got to keep pushing this thing out there because it's not like, becoming viral by itself, I guess, is the thing. Or, word of mouth is super important, but yeah, we just got to use that grassroots energy, and maybe time as it slowly builds that exponential curve where people start hearing about it, right? So, but no, I think, I'm really glad that you guys are passionate about these subjects and can clue in on, what a big story it is. That's how I felt when I first came across it. So, especially for economics students, it's like, there are a few things you're learning that, you want to question. So, but.
All right, Maren, I think that's it for us. But I really want to say from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much for doing this.
Honestly,
I remember back when we saw you, it really meant so much to us that you said you would come on the pod. We finally made it happen. And all the best, and thank you so much again.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. And I guess I should just say our website is findingmoneyfilm.com. So we'll have the info on there where you can watch on Vimeo and elsewhere. And then, any upcoming screenings that might be, continue to pop up around the world. Or if you want to organize a screening in your, at your university or your town, we can do that. So yeah, there's different ways to get it out there and have discussions and keep this thing moving forward. So yeah, thank you guys so much for having me and doing what you're doing.
No worries. Thank you. And we'll put also all the information in the description of all of our socials, and
we'll be spreading it.
Yeah,
we'll be spreading it as well.
We'll be doing our part. Don't worry. So
perfect.
Thank you so much, Maren.
Thank you, Maren.
Thank you, guys.
We'll end the
Thanks
recording.
Take care, Maren. All the best.